Have you ever wondered why it is that 95% of diets fail? There's always talk about this approach or that approach, works for some people, doesn't work for other people, but none of them seem to work over time. I'm going to give you the reason why. I've thought about this a lot. I've come to some realizations from consulting my own experience and guiding a lot of other people through in coaching and personal training and hypnotherapy. What I've come to realize is that it's an addiction. This is really fundamental. I don't really mean it in a funny way. I mean it in a very serious way. We are all addicted. When you look at the behaviors of people who are trying to quit smoking or alcohol or drugs, the exact same behaviors happen. People are constantly setting goals to change and failing through them. Classic thing with smokers, I'm going to start, on Monday, this is the last packet, this is the last packet. And it just becomes this joke where they're just constantly trying and constantly failing. There's always this desire to be doing it, and then they just seem to be constantly stumbling over it. Think about what dieting is like. It's exactly the same. It's always on Monday. It's always starting and stopping and constantly setting these goals and falling short of them or failing. When you see it, it becomes so obvious, but I think there's so much resistance to it because people don't want to accept the label of an addict. They don't want to see themselves that way. And also it just seems like an odd thing to put together because it's like, well, everyone eats. So, just the fact that everyone's doing it doesn't mean that we're not addicted. But I mean, it's bigger than that. Who can stop themselves eating? Who is not eating? There's nothing anyone can do about it. We are compulsively addicted to food. Right? It's not a matter of if we're addicted, it's just a matter of to what degree. Addiction does exist on a spectrum. When you think about sort of the alcoholics, that someone who drinks every night, say, and then they say, well, at least I'm not as, like if they're looking at the guy who's stumbling around and in the gutter every night, well, at least I'm not that bad. There's always someone who's worse. So it's always just like, oh, well, at least I'm not that bad. At least I'm not that bad. So, and then we sort of push it away because we don't want to accept the fact that we're addicts. But like I said, it's on a spectrum. Even if you're having just 2 drinks a night or something and you just can't stop it, if you can't stop, you're addicted, And so with food, we're addicted, It's something that we have to constantly manage. Having an addiction is defined by 4 characteristics, the 4 C's. Right, so the first one is craving. Right, so if you're having cravings, so obviously with food, there's cravings there. Everyone craves food all the time. So the second one is having trouble controlling the frequency or amount that you use, right? And often that's the case. We don't know when we're full, too much dessert, or whatever the case may be. That seems to constantly be there for everyone. The next one is compulsion, having the compulsive desire to have it, and that's very common with food, right? We're compulsed to have the food, especially if you haven't had some for a long time, then you'll start to have this compulsive need to have some. The fourth one is either having trouble recognizing the consequences involved with it, or knowing the consequences and yet despite that, still continuing to use, right? When someone knows that they're overeating, making them overweight, it's making them unhappy, it's not helping them, and the doctor might have told them to stop eating so much, cut down your sugar, it's affecting your health, and then they still continue to do it, right? So again, these happen in varying degrees for people, but the reality is these elements are here for pretty much everyone, even if it's on a small scale. But I'm saying for, especially if you've come to this video, you're probably on the higher end of the spectrum there. Taking on this perspective, understanding this, gives us a better insight into what the best way to approach weight loss is, or the best way to approach our health goals. Understanding this frame means that it's actually more functional to approach weight loss from the perspective of addiction and really applying the right strategy. When you think about it from this perspective, asking the question, what is the right way to approach weight loss? What is the right way to do it? It's just as silly as saying, what is the right therapy for someone? It depends on the person. It depends on how deep in the problem someone is, how much they're struggling with it, how long that's been a problem for. Really, it's funny when you think about it, applying any addiction framework or ideas about addiction is probably typically going to be more successful than thinking about applying a diet strategy over the long term, because as they say, 95% of diets fail over a long enough period of time. Because the whole frame is wrong, trying to think about it from a purely biological, scientific perspective. It's not the hard science of biology that we're working with here. It's the soft science of psychology we're working with here. When we go to do any of these things, the psychology is always involved. How we're going to be emotionally and psychologically going to be responding to all the things that we're doing and all the changes we're trying to implement. Right, and all the reactions that our sort of unconscious system is going to produce. Now, again, a lot like in addiction, so you start doing something, you've got cravings, you've got consequences, you've got all these things interacting. When you apply one thing, other things start reacting, other aspects of your life and psychological aspects start reacting. So this is something that people have to come to through their own discovery, and when they're ready, right, and accept this reality, right? I think it's a hard reality to accept sometimes for some people, but that's the only way true change happens. True change happens through just facing reality as it is, and then just putting one foot in front of the other. So when people talk about a particular diet or a way of approaching weight loss, and then saying, it doesn't work, it doesn't, or this keto doesn't work, or calorie counting doesn't work, or whatever it is. The reality is it doesn't do anything. It doesn't produce weight loss. These are techniques that people can use, but ultimately it's the person that makes it work or not. And people are only going to be able to make work what they're ready to make work. And when you think about the frame of addiction, and they're going to lapse and relapse a number of times. You're going to go back and forth, and it's going to be a journey of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and then maybe 3 steps forward and 1 step back, and then there are times where you go 5 or 10 steps forward and you go 1 or 2 steps back, and then that's the journey of change. That's the journey of getting out of that place and into a better place where you consistently maintain these changes that you've grown into your life. And once you've evolved, you get out of this place through personal development, through growing as a person. And then when you're understanding yourself, understanding addiction, understanding your patterns, then you've got a handle on it. You've got a handle on yourself. This is about self-management. Because the problem with this is by far the hardest addiction to manage. Because you cannot get out of the cravings, you cannot get away from it, you can't get away from the consequences of it. We are unable to walk away from this addiction. It must be managed, and that requires a lot of character and a lot of consideration. It really is challenging, but is absolutely possible. And I know from my own personal experience, I was a little fat kid, 30 kilos overweight. All I wanted to do was play video games and eat junk food, and I just couldn't think of anything worse than exercising and being healthy. Couldn't care less about it. But there was a point at which I just became too fat, too fast, and that kick-started me into changing and into wanting change. So that was a seed that was planted. But then I sort of got myself into action and lost some weight, but then keeping it required me to really understand what brought me there, and then to keep those changes through growing as a person. I started to put the weight back on, and then I started to realize that was what needed to happen, that was my whole person that needed to change to start enjoying this and start valuing it. My values changed. It wasn't just my actions, it was what I was valuing that needed to change and stay there. So the mindset that they take in Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, is basically that once you're an addict, you're always an addict, and you'll always have this addiction that needs to be recognized and managed. Even if you've been sober for years, that even if you trip up one day, you've got to face up to that, recognize it, and know that it was still a danger, and that it's always something you can fall back into. Being really hyper aware of that and conscious of it and vigilant with it. You know, never taking it for granted, never taking your sobriety for granted. The thing with food though, is it's absolutely true. You cannot get away from food. You cannot stop eating. So it's absolutely something that you're always kind of tickling those neurons, getting tempted by circumstances, getting together for family events and you know, social gatherings, or even, you know, just every night for dinner, you know, dessert maybe starts tempting you, you know. Anything that tastes a bit sweet starts to make you want that extra chocolate or that extra, you know, little vice that you have. This is absolutely something that we need to be constantly conscious of, never complacent with, empower ourselves as much as possible. This is why it takes personal development to stay there. It takes personal development to be consistently managing your body and your weight and stay at the weight that you want to, because it does require to be constantly managing an addiction. You know, and it's not for the weak-hearted to have a high quality management of something so powerful. So that's my thoughts for today, and I hope you enjoyed that. And if you want to hear more about my perspective and my thoughts on things, then click this video right here and I'll see you there.